going to come from what Mary Ann read for us today from 2 Timothy. It's Paul's second letter to a young pastor by the name of Timothy. Paul has really taken hold of Timothy. He loves Timothy very much. In fact, Paul calls him his child of faith. And it was probably Paul that was instrumental in bringing Timothy into the idea of being a Christian, or following what they called at that time the way. He came from two very good people in his family, Timothy did. His mom and his grandmother taught him the scriptures well. But it was probably Paul who took him under his wing, and eventually Timothy decided that he wanted to follow in Paul's footsteps. In the second letter that Mary Ann read for us, chapter 4, really, Timothy, it contains some really intimate material. It's personal. It's a personal letter. It's not like the other letters that Paul wrote in which he intended for them to be read in certain churches. For instance, in Ephesus or to Corinth, Corinthians and Rome and so forth. This was a personal letter. And it was written to his friend, this young protege, Timothy. And he writes this letter, interestingly enough, from jail. Paul's been in jail before. This is not new to him, to be in jail. But Paul knows full well that his life will soon end. He won't be getting out this time. And he understands that, and he knows it. And this whole letter, and I invite you to go home and read this. It's not but 4 chapters long, and it's a wonderful letter. But in this letter, it really centers around Paul's coming trial. He says some really interesting things, knowing full well that he's getting ready to lose his life. And it's interesting to hear what he has to say. He charges this young Timothy to be steadfast in the faith. Hold to the faith, Timothy. Hold to it. And he goes on to tell him that even though he's going to come to the end, and he knows that he's at the end, he sees life as a sacrifice. He understands what he's been living for. And he tells Timothy in this letter, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering." And he understands that God has used him. And he understands that. And he tells him, "I know that, and I'm perfectly aware of it, and in time my departure is near." But he tells him to keep moving. Paul wants Timothy to understand that there will be those in his life that will abandon him. Oh, he'll bring on a flock for himself as a pastor, and sure he will. But when it gets down to witnessing to Christ and to what God is about, many people will abandon him. And he wants him to understand that. He wants him to see that that kind of thing happens when we witness, when we profess our beliefs, when we find the need to do that. He tells him, "At my first offense, no one came to my support, but everyone deserted me." And he said, "Let that not be held against them, though." And Paul wants to assure Timothy that God will not abandon him. He wants him to know you're going to feel that way sometimes. We all do. But he wants him to understand that you're not going to be abandoned. That's not the way it works. And again, we hear Paul talk to Timothy through this letter. "But the Lord stood at my side and gave me strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed, and all the Gentiles might hear it. And I was delivered from the lion's mouth." And he assures Timothy, yes, things will be tough, but you can count on God. He won't abandon you. He won't leave you. And Timothy will indeed face those times in his life. He'll be faced with rejection. There will be people that will not even want to hear him. He'll be faced with desertion. People will back away. And he will face persecution in his life. Paul's not trying to hide anything from Timothy. He's just trying to get him to understand that those days will come. But what's important, Timothy, is that you keep witnessing. You keep moving. You profess to your God. You hold to your faith, even when it begins to shake. Hold. Hold to it, is what he tells him. And he encourages Timothy to keep going. I have fought the good fight. He hasn't won every fight, but he's fought the good fight. I have finished the race, he tells Timothy. He may not have won the race, but he did finish it. And he tells him, I have kept the faith. Even when it would have been easier to drop it and move away, he kept it. He held to it. That's what you do when you witness to people. That's what you do when you profess your religion and talk to people about who you are. And I think most of us, most Christians often wonder, what kind of witness would they be in the time of trial? Back during the summer, I took a course of study that's required, and for a local pastor, we have to take those that are part-time, take 2 a year at Millsats. And we were at school that night, and the instructor gave us a break, and when he gives you a break, you better take it, because you never know when you're going to get another one. So we were out in the hall, and I was talking with a friend of mine that I didn't know, and another man, a pastor from South Louisiana, came walking up, and we were sitting there drinking a cup of coffee, and his friend turned to him and said, Lee, you look down. He said, I am a little bit. He said, what's the problem? He said, yesterday I got a call from one of my parishioners that their young daughter had been hit by a car. And I went to the hospital to see if she was going to be all right, and she's in pretty critical condition now. He said, but when I got there, instead of comforting the mother, she runs up to me and starts pounding me on the chest, wanting to know, why has God let this happen? She's a good girl. Why is she in this condition? He said, my problem was I didn't know how to talk to her about that. And that happens to us sometimes, doesn't it? We want to witness. We want to tell people about the God that we love and that he will be her strength. But he said, I just couldn't find the words. It happens. Paul was trying to tell Timothy the very thing, that same thing. But just hold on to the faith. I sometimes wonder how effective my witness would be in a case like that. Would I be able to stand my ground? Sometimes we do. Sometimes we don't. Would I be willing to face hostility? And we think about those things. But you know what's really interesting? You know what we really need to understand? You might not believe it, but it actually is true. We face those trials every day. We're given those opportunities every day of our life to witness in some way, some form, in some fashion to someone in our lives. It could be in your office. It could be standing in the checkout line at a Walmart, a Kroger, or Piggly Wiggly. It could be at the barbershop or the beauty salon on Saturday morning if you're waiting your turn to get into the chair. There's just no telling, maybe a sporting event, or sitting in the waiting room at a doctor or a dentist's office. But at some point, somewhere, there is an opportunity for all of us in some way. And I think we all wonder, what kind of witness would we be in the time of trial when we know someone needs to hear the good news? You see, at some point, the trial takes place. And we are called to witness to our faith. We are called to witness to our faith. I'm sure that Timothy would like to ask Paul a question, and that's, where do you find the strength and the courage to do that? Witnessing is not always easy. And where do you find the courage and the strength to do that? And I believe Timothy probably wanted to know that. And again, we hear Paul speak to this young pastor. The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. God will watch after us. God delights in watching after us. In this letter, Paul not only offering this young pastor some ideas from an old apostle to a young preacher about how to witness and what to say. Do you see what's happening in this particular letter? Paul's in jail. Paul is going to eventually, at some point, be executed. And yet we see this very apostle sit there and tell him, it's going to be okay. It's going to work out. And you just keep moving in the right direction. You see what's really happening is Paul is not just witnessing to the gospel. Brothers and sisters, he's living the gospel. It's not just words, it's actions. And Paul is doing that in this very point, in this letter. Sometimes our witnessing is not always in our words. It can be in our actions. There's a story about St. Francis of Assisi that went to a young monk and asked him, do you want to go into town and preach with me today? Of course, the young monk was absolutely ecstatic over it and said, yes, I'd love to. So they go into this town and they walk up and down the main streets and inside the alleys and up some of the short streets, into some of the shops and out and all over. They're rubbing shoulders with hundreds of people all day long. And at the end of the day, St. Francis turns to this young monk and says it's time to go home. They get a little ways out of town, and the monk, a little bit incensed, and he turns to him and says, I thought you wanted to preach in the town today. And he stops and looks at him, and he says, my friend, we have been preaching. We've been preaching while we've been walking. We preached while we were walking. We were seen by many, and our behavior was closely watched. How we conducted ourselves, how we approached people, how we received them. And he finished by telling him, it is of no use to walk anywhere to preach unless we preach everywhere as we walk. You may be the only Bible that a person ever reads, and it'll be by your actions. We are called to witness in word and in deed. You and I need to heed the words of this apostle. We need to hear this personal letter. I invite you sometime today, go home and read those 4 chapters. They're not long. And I invite you to hear what Paul says. We need to live out our faith in our word and by God's grace in our deeds. We need to do that. And as we struggle in our witness, and sometimes it is a struggle. Oh, sometimes it is a struggle. But let's remember the words Paul wrote to Timothy when he says, now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord of righteous judge will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy